first thing the German commander saw was not the American star. It was the barrel. It reached across the rubble like a piece of railroad, iron bolted to a turret, too long for a Sherman, too long for any American tank he had been taught to fear, longer even than the gun-on vehicles that had made German heavy armor famous. April 21st, 1945, Dessau, Germany. The city was already broken. Bombing had crushed whole blocks into brick dust. Streets ended in collapsed walls. Doorways opened into rooms that no longer had roofs. Every intersection looked empty until it killed somebody. And at one of those intersections, 600 yards away, a German tank crew found itself staring at a machine that was not supposed to exist. The German commander had seconds. He fired first. The round missed close enough that the American crew felt the air slap the hull. Inside the American tank, Corporal John Irwin did not have time to be afraid. He had a sight picture. He had a target. And he had something American tankers had been begging for since Normandy. A gun that could answer. He fired. What happened next became one of the most argued tank stories of the Second World War. Some called it the moment an American supertank finally killed a German supertank. Others, reading the unit records later, said the destroyed vehicle was almost certainly not a King Tiger at all. But the important part was never the name painted on the enemy tank. The important part was this. For the first time, an American crew rolled into a German street with a weapon that made the other side hesitate. And that weapon had arrived almost too late to matter. To understand why the T-26E4 Super Pershing looked so strange in Dessau, you have to go back to the summer of 1944, when American tank crews were learning the war through fire. The M4 Sherman was not a joke. It was reliable. It was mobile. It could be built in numbers that Germany could not match. It crossed oceans, kept moving, and carried Allied armies from the beaches into the heart of Europe. But there is a brutal difference between a good tank and a tank that can survive the enemy in front of it. By Normandy, American crews were meeting German armor that did not care how many Shermans the factories had built. The Tiger II, the King Tiger, weighed nearly 70 tons. Its glacis plate was thick, sloped, and hard enough to turn most Allied tank fire into sparks. The standard 75mm Sherman could not defeat it from the front in any meaningful combat situation. The 76mm Sherman was an improvement, but not a cure. The numbers were merciless. A 76mm gun firing standard ammunition could not reliably solve a 150mm sloped frontal plate. A German 88 could destroy Allied tanks at ranges where an American gunner might still be trying to identify what he was looking at. That was not theory. That was a burning tank on a French road. That was a crewman dragged out alive, but never whole again. That was a platoon learning in one afternoon that courage does not change penetration tables. American tankers adapted because soldiers always adapt. They flanked when they could. They used artillery. They used smoke. They attacked from angles. They waited for aircraft. They sent 3 tanks to do what one better, armed vehicle might have done. But adaptation has a cost. Every clever workaround was being paid for by men inside thin steel boxes. And the worst part was that the solution had already been imagined. It was not waiting for a miracle breakthrough. It was not waiting for a new element from a laboratory. It was waiting for permission. The American T-26 program had been moving through tests since 1942. Engineers knew a heavier tank with better armor and a 90mm gun could change the battlefield equation. They had ballistic data. They had captured German examples. They had evidence. What they did not have was institutional agreement. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, head of Army Ground Forces, believed American tanks should not be designed primarily to fight other tanks. In his doctrine, tanks supported infantry and exploited breakthroughs. Enemy armor was the job of tank destroyers. That idea had a clean logic on paper. On paper, the tank destroyers would be where they were needed. On paper, enemy armor would appear in predictable ways. On paper, the Sherman did not need to become heavier, slower, or more expensive. War did not stay on paper. In the hedgerows, in villages, on ridgelines, and in snow, enemy tanks appeared wherever American armor had to go, and when they did, the men inside Shermans did not have the luxury of explaining Doctrine to an 88mm shell. The doctrine was wrong, but institutions do not admit wrongness quickly. They ask for more data. They form another board. They protect the assumptions that made yesterday's decisions sound reasonable. McNair died in July 1944, killed by friendly bombs during Operation Cobra. His death removed the most powerful obstacle, but it did not recover the months already lost. By the time the M36 Pershing finally reached Europe in meaningful test numbers, the calendar had turned to 1945. The Zebra mission delivered 20 Pershings to the theater. 20. Not 20 battalions, not 20 companies, 20 tanks. For crews who had spent months inside Shermans, the Pershing was a revelation. It had thicker armor. It carried a 90mm M3 gun. It looked and felt like America had finally accepted the kind of war its tankers were actually fighting. But even the Pershing was not the final answer. Against Panthers, it was dangerous. Against many German vehicles, it was more than enough. But against the King Tiger at extended range, the standard 90mm gun still did not fully reverse the arithmetic. The gap had narrowed, it had not disappeared. And somewhere in Ohio, engineers were preparing something more extreme. At Wellman Engineering Company, a single T-26E1 prototype was modified into a weapon that looked almost absurd. The standard 90mm gun came out. The T-15E1 went in. This was still a 90mm gun, but that number hides the violence of the change. The barrel was 73 calibers long, compared with 53 calibers on the standard M3. The chamber was larger, the round was longer. The muzzle velocity jumped dramatically. The gun could drive armor, piercing ammunition toward the target at speeds close to 1,140 meters per second. With tungsten cord ammunition, its penetration figures reached the kind of numbers American crews had been waiting for, roughly 260 millimeters at 1,000 meters under favorable testing conditions. For the first time, an American tank gun could look at the frontal protection of a King Tiger and make the answer something other than prayer. But building power into a gun is never free. The barrel was so long that the turret needed external stabilizer springs to manage the weight. The ammunition was awkward, nearly 50 inches long, hard to stow, harder to handle. Loading it took practice. The whole vehicle became a compromise wrapped around a weapon. It was not elegant. It was what happens when a problem has been ignored long enough that the answer has to become extreme. Only one was sent to Europe. One T-26E4 Super Pershing. When it reached the 3rd Armored Division, Captain Belton Cooper saw both the promise and the weakness immediately. The gun was terrifying. The armor was not. The Super Pershing was built on the Pershing hull. It carried extraordinary firepower, but a King Tiger's 88 could still threaten it at range. So Cooper and his maintenance men did what armies in the field have always done when official solutions arrive unfinished. They improvised. They cut armor from knocked out German Panthers. 2 38mm plates went onto the front hull. A heavy 80mm Panther plate was welded over the mantlet. The crews cut openings for the gun's sight and coaxial machine gun. Extra plates on the turret helped balance the added weight. It was rough. It was ugly. It added about 5 tons to a vehicle whose drivetrain was already working hard, but to the men who would ride inside it, rough steel was better than clean theory. The result looked like something built in anger. A Pershing hull buried under scavenged Panther armor, mechanical springs braced along the turret, a gun barrel stretching so far forward that driving through a city became a calculation. It was not just a tank, it was an indictment with tracks. Staff Sergeant Joseph Madra took command of the vehicle in April 1945. Corporal John Irwin sat behind the gun. They were not chosen to become symbols. They were tankers, and tankers judge machines by whether those machines keep men alive long enough to return fire. On April 4th, before Dessau, the Super Pershing got its first chance to answer. The division was moving between the Weser River and Northeim when German fire came from a wooded position. Irwin acquired a target at roughly 1,500 yards. At that distance, American crews were used to uncertainty. Would the round penetrate? Would the target even be what it seemed? Would the enemy have time to fire back? Irwin fired once. The target exploded with such violence that witnesses remembered debris lifting dozens of feet into the air. One shot, 1,500 yards. Whatever the enemy vehicle was, the lesson moved through the regiment faster than paperwork. The strange tank worked. The long gun was not just dramatic, it was useful. And usefulness, in combat, becomes faith. Then came Dessau. By late April 1945, Germany was collapsing inward. The war in Europe had days left, but nobody inside a tank could behave as if the last shell had already been fired. A war does not become safe because historians know its ending. The 3rd Armored Division entered a city shredded by bombing and still dangerous in every street. Urban combat punished tanks in a special way. Long-range advantages disappeared behind walls. Rubble forced vehicles into predictable paths. A gun barrel could reveal a tank before the crew saw the threat. A window, a cellar, a side street, a dead vehicle. Any of them could hide a weapon. The Super Pershing moved through that maze as part of the spearhead. Madra scanned from the commander's position. Irwin watched through the sight. Then, at an intersection, the German tank appeared, 600 yards away. The German crew fired first. The shell missed. Irwin's first response was high explosive. The round struck, but did not destroy the vehicle. That mattered. It told him the target was armored enough that a casual hit would not solve it. Then the German tank began to move. It climbed a rubble pile, either trying to get cover or escape the angle. In doing so, it made the one mistake no tank designer wants to imagine. It exposed its belly. The underside of a tank is not built to duel. It is thinner because it is supposed to face the ground, not a gunner waiting across a ruined street. Irwin saw the opening. He fired the armor, piercing round. The shot went through the underside. Ammunition inside the hull detonated. The turret lifted off and landed in the street. The fight had lasted roughly 20 seconds. That was enough time for a legend to be born. The crew believed they had destroyed a tiger. Later writers pushed the story further, turning the enemy into a king tiger, and the moment into the duel everyone wanted. America's supertank killing Germany's supertank in the rubble of the Reich, but the records are colder than legend. German Tiger II units appear to have been far from Dessau that day, fighting closer to Berlin. American reports from the area mention Panthers and Panzer IVs, not King Tigers. In the confusion of urban combat, misidentification was common, even among experienced men. A German vehicle seen through smoke, rubble, impact, and fear could become a tiger in a heartbeat. The destroyed tank was probably a Panzer IV, maybe something else, almost certainly not the mythical King Tiger. And still, the myth misses the deeper truth, because the value of the Super Pershing was not that it proved a perfect legend. It proved a broken system could have produced the right answer earlier. That is why the story hurts. On April 22nd, the day after the famous engagement, the Super Pershing met a disabled Panther whose turret still worked. The Panther fired. Irwin fired back and destroyed it. Later, 2 German medium tanks crossed the Super Pershing's field of fire. Irwin destroyed the first. The second stopped, and its crew surrendered. They had seen enough. That was essentially the combat life of the only Super Pershing in Europe. A handful of engagements in the last weeks of a war already collapsing. Then May 8th came. Germany surrendered. The tank that might have changed the way American crews fought in 1944 arrived as the curtain was falling in 1945. After the war, the arithmetic became impossible to avoid. Allied teams examined captured German armor. They measured plates. They tested weapons. They compared what crews had known in their bones against what engineers could put in tables. The standard Pershing had narrowed the gap with German heavy armor. The Super Pershing's gun had closed it. But one experimental vehicle does not change a campaign. It does not undo Normandy. It does not unburn Sherman's. It does not bring back men who died because the machine they were given was asked to fight a heavier war than it was built for. That is the cruelty of being right too late. The lesson did not disappear. It moved forward into the Cold War. The Soviets showed the IS-3 in Berlin in 1945 with a sharply sloped pike nose and the kind of frontal protection that made Western observers understand immediately that the next armor problem had already arrived. The United States could not afford to treat heavy armor as a doctrinal inconvenience anymore. The Pershing line evolved. The M36 patent corrected the Pershing's weak mobility with a more powerful Continental engine. In Korea, when American units first faced North Korean 3485s, light tanks like the M24 Chaffee were badly outmatched. Once heavier American armor arrived, the equation shifted. The 90mm guns of the Pershing and Patton family gave us crews a way to fight and win at ranges where earlier vehicles had been vulnerable. The M47 and M48 followed, then the M60. Then decades later, the M1 Abrams carried forward the principle that McNair's doctrine had resisted. An American tank must be able to destroy the best enemy armor it is likely to face at the range where the fight will actually happen. That principle sounds obvious, only because men paid for it before it became obvious. Joseph Madra survived the war and disappeared back into civilian life the way millions of men did. No parade was built around the Super Pershing crew. No single ceremony captured what that vehicle represented. The war ended, and America began the huge work of turning soldiers back into citizens. John Irwin also survived. Years later, his account of the Dessau fight became the foundation for nearly every retelling. What stands out is not exaggeration, but restraint. He described what he saw. He described the shot, the exposed belly, the turret leaving the hull. He did not claim certainty where the battlefield had not given it to him. That honesty matters. The legend grew around him, not because he needed to invent one, but because audiences wanted the clean version: one American supertank, one German supertank, one duel, one answer. Real history is rarely that obedient. Captain Belton Cooper, the maintenance officer, who helped turn the Super Pershing from a gun on tracks into something survivable, later wrote about the cost of American tank decisions with the anger of a man who had counted wrecks, not read summaries. He understood the distance between a policy debate and a burned vehicle. He understood that bad doctrine does not die in conference rooms. It dies inside crews. The original Super Pershing returned to the United States after the war. It was evaluated, studied, and eventually stripped of its uniqueness. The tank itself was scrapped. The gun survived. There is something almost too perfect about that. The hull, the improvised Panther plates, the rough steel answer that had rolled through Dessau, disappeared into the post-war world. But the gun, the physical expression of the lesson, remained. Firepower mattered, range mattered, armor mattered, and timing mattered most of all. Because a correct answer delivered after the dead are already buried is not the same thing as wisdom. Leslie McNair was not a fool. That is what makes the story more frightening, not less. He was intelligent, influential, and convinced. He had a doctrine that made sense inside the structure that produced it. The failure was not stupidity. The failure was certainty. When battlefield evidence contradicted the doctrine, the institution treated the evidence as something to be managed instead of something to be obeyed. Engineers could calculate the need. Crews could feel the need. Maintenance officers could see the need in the holes punched through American steel. But the system moved slowly until it was allowed to move. And by then, time had become the enemy too. That is the real story of the Super Pershing. Not a perfect duel, not a clean myth, not a 20-second answer in a ruined German street. The real story is the distance between what a country can build and what its institutions permit it to build. The Super Pershing crossed that distance on tracks, with salvaged armor welded to its face, and a barrel too long for the Doctrine that had delayed it. It arrived late. It fought briefly. It proved enough, and then it vanished. But the lesson stayed in every American tank that came after it. A machine is never only steel. It is also a decision. It is a doctrine made physical. It is a promise to the men inside that someone, somewhere, listened before the math became a casualty report. In 1944, that promise came too slowly. In Dessau, for 20 seconds, it finally arrived. The war was already ending. The proof was not. The tank was scrapped. The gun survived. And the question it left behind still has weight. How many men died in the gap between knowing the answer and allowing it to exist?